Death in the underworld rarely arrives with any warning. It usually appears dressed in a bespoke suit, poured smoothly into a crystal goblet of fine scotch. When the most feared man in Chicago raised a poisoned glass to his lips, it was not a highly trained assassin who saved him. It was a terrified, invisible waitress who found the courage to act. To survive in Chicago's unforgiving criminal empire, one must master the art of becoming unnoticeable. For Lila Monroe, invisibility was never merely a tactic. It had become her reality, forced upon her by a world that only valued a certain kind of woman. She carried a softness in her figure that stood in quiet contrast to the sharp, artificially enhanced hostesses who normally moved through the floors of Il Crepuscolo. Il Crepuscolo, the Twilight, was a private subterranean dining club hidden beneath the bustling streets of the Gold Coast. It served as neutral ground for the city's most dangerous predators. Made men, corrupt politicians, and cartel liaisons broke bread here beneath an unspoken rule of peace. Lila had served in the VIP lounge for years. The powerful men who frequented the club never looked at her twice. To them, she was part of the mahogany furniture, a necessary mechanism to deliver their steaks and scotch, stripped of any identity. Yet her invisibility was her greatest asset. Because no one paid attention to the quiet waitress, no one guarded their tongues or hid their sleight of hand when she was pouring the water. Over time, Lila had seen payoffs exchanged beneath linen tablecloths. She had heard whispers of hits ordered over plates of veal scallopini. She knew which capos were sleeping with whose wives and which politicians were desperate for a bailout. She cataloged every secret behind a blank, pleasant smile, using her generous tips to pay down the remnants of her late father's crippling gambling debts. On this night, the air inside Il Crepuscolo felt thick enough to choke on. The ambient jazz seemed muted, crushed beneath the heavy, suffocating tension radiating from Table 4. At its head sat Dario Valenti, newly crowned as the head of the Valenti Syndicate after a bloody, ruthless purge that had left the streets of Chicago whispering his name in hushed, terrified tones. He was known as the architect for his cold, calculating mind and his complete lack of mercy. Unlike the aging, boisterous mobsters of the past, Dario was sharp, athletic, and possessed a chillingly calm demeanor. His dark eyes missed nothing. Seated opposite him was Enzo Moretti, a veteran capo who controlled the lucrative shipping ports on Lake Michigan. Enzo belonged to the old guard, flashy, loud, and deeply resentful of taking orders from a younger man. Flanking them were their bodyguards, Dario's right-hand man, the towering and stoic Matteo, and Enzo's enforcer, the twitchy, broad-shouldered Frankie. Lila stood quietly by the service station, perfectly still. A crisp white towel draped over her forearm. She watched the table with the trained eye of a gazelle monitoring a watering hole shared with lions. "You're asking for too much, Dario," Enzo rumbled, leaning back in his velvet chair. He chewed on the end of an unlit Cuban cigar, his heavily ringed fingers drumming against the table. "The ports belong to my crew. My father bled for those docks. You want a 20% cut? That's extortion, even by our standards." Dario did not raise his voice. He did not even shift in his seat. He merely steepled his fingers, staring at Enzo with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. "It is not a request, Enzo. It is the new structure. The Colombians are bringing their freight through our routes, and I am guaranteeing their safety. Security requires capital. You will pay the 20%, or you will find yourself relieved of the burden of managing the ports entirely." Enzo's jaw tightened. A flash of pure, unadulterated hatred crossed his weathered face before it was masked by a forced, booming laugh. All right, you're the boss, Valenti. I may not like it, but I respect the chair. We'll do it your way." Lila narrowed her eyes. She had grown up around degenerate gamblers and seasoned liars. Enzo's laugh was hollow. The capitulation had come too fast, too easily. A man like Enzo would never surrender his father's legacy without a fight unless he already knew the fight was lost. To the new structure, then, Enzo declared, raising a hand to signal the bar. Let's drink to it. A bottle of the Macallan 25, and make sure it's the good stuff, not the swill you serve the tourists upstairs. A cold prickle of red washed over the back of Lila's neck. She pushed herself off the wall, smoothed her black apron, and walked briskly toward the mahogany bar. Something was wrong. The air pressure in the room felt off, heavy with the metallic tang of impending violence. As she approached the bar, she noticed Enzo's enforcer Frankie leaning casually against the brass rail, speaking in low tones to the head bartender, Felix. Felix was a jumpy, thin man with a severe cocaine habit Lila knew he struggled to afford. When she stepped up to the service well, Frankie immediately stopped talking and turned his back, returning to table 4. Felix looked up, his face glistening with a sheen of nervous sweat. "Table 4, bottle of Macallan 25, 3 glasses," Lila said, keeping her voice even and perfectly devoid of emotion. Felix nodded quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the top-shelf bottle. "Right away, Lila." She stood at the service well, her eyes instinctively dropping to the polished mirror finish of the bar counter. She watched Felix line up 3 heavy crystal snifters. Her heart skipped a beat. She saw it, a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement. Felix uncorked the scotch and poured a generous measure into the first 2 glasses. But before pouring the third, his thumb flicked over the rim. A tiny, translucent droplet of clear liquid fell from a concealed vial in his palm, dissolving instantly into the amber pool. It was so fast, so practiced that anyone else would have missed it. But Lila was not anyone else. She was the invisible wallflower, and she saw everything. Her blood ran ice cold. Poison. It had to be. A bullet inside Il Crepuscolo would start a mob war that would burn Chicago to the ground, bringing down the wrath of the Commission and the FBI at once. But a sudden heart attack, a tragic, unforeseen medical emergency striking the young, high-stress boss of the Valenti family, that would look clean, deniable. Enzo would inherit the throne by morning. Felix placed the glasses onto Lila's silver serving tray. He meticulously adjusted their placement. The tainted glass sat at the front right, exactly where she would instinctively reach first when serving the head of the table. "Take it," Felix muttered, avoiding her eyes. He wiped his brow with a bar towel. "Don't keep them waiting." Lila's mind raced as she gripped the edges of the tray. The metal felt as heavy as an anvil. The #1 rule of surviving in her world pounded in her ears like a war drum. See nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. If she spoke up and accused Enzo, Frankie would likely pull a gun and shoot her before the words fully left her mouth. If she accused Felix, it would be her word against a veteran bartender's, and Enzo would simply deny it, marking her for death the moment she clocked out. She was just an unremarkable waitress. Who would believe her? Who would protect her? Yet as she turned to walk toward table 4, her eyes met Dario Valenti's across the dimly lit room. He was perfectly composed, yet utterly isolated, a young man carrying the weight of an empire, surrounded by vipers eager to strip the flesh from his bones. Lila remembered a night in the past when a drunk, handsy associate had cornered her in the coat room. Dario, who had merely been a capo at the time, had walked by. He had not raised his voice. He had simply looked at the man and said softly, "She is working. Leave her." It was the only time in her life a man of power had seen her as a human being worthy of basic dignity. She could not let him die. The walk from the bar to the table felt endless. Her brain worked in overdrive, calculating physics, angles, and human psychology. The silent switch. She reached table 4. The men fell silent, the heavy air thick with anticipation. Enzo was practically vibrating with poorly concealed excitement, his eyes fixed on the tray. Matteo took a half-step forward to inspect the drinks, standard protocol. "Gentlemen," Lila murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "According to our customs, the boss of highest rank is served first. Dario." She stepped to his right side. Her trembling hand reached for the tainted glass at the front right of the tray. Now or never. As her fingers brushed the crystal, Lila intentionally shifted her weight off balance. She let her hip collide heavily with the thick wooden armrest of Enzo's chair. "Oh, excuse me, sir," she gasped, feigning a clumsy, mortified fumble. The sudden jolt tipped the heavy silver tray just enough. Enzo flinched, leaning back to avoid any spillage, his eyes darting away in annoyance. "Watch it, sweetheart," he snapped. In that singular fraction of a second, while Enzo's eyes were averted and Matteo stepped forward to steady the table, Lila's hands moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned card sharp. She did not drop the tray. Instead, she used the momentum of the stumble to rotate it smoothly. Her left hand slid the clean glass from the back of the tray forward, seamlessly placing it in front of Dario. In the same breath, her right hand deposited the poisoned glass directly onto the coaster in front of Enzo. It was a beautiful, terrifying ballet of sleight of hand. She quickly placed the third glass in front of Matteo and stepped back, bowing her head in a perfect portrait of a humiliated, clumsy servant. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Moretti. I lost my footing." "Just get out of here," Enzo growled, waving her away dismissively. He had not seen a thing. He was too arrogant, too focused on the prize. But someone else had. Lila backed away into the shadows of the velvet curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up and froze. Dario Valenti was staring directly at her. He had not touched his glass. He sat perfectly motionless, his dark eyes locked onto her pale, sweat-sheened face. Dario was a man who survived by reading the smallest details. He had seen the reflection of Felix wiping his sweaty brow in the bar mirror. He had noticed Enzo's unnatural eagerness for a toast, and most importantly, he had watched his waitress. He had seen the terror in her eyes as she approached. He had seen the calculated, deliberate bump of her hip against the chair. He had tracked the impossible, fluid blur of her hands as she swapped the drinks. She had switched the glass. The realization hit Dario like a physical blow, though his face remained a mask of marble. This invisible, unassuming woman had just risked her life to alter the board of a deadly game. "Well," Enzo said, lifting the heavy crystal snifter, completely ignorant of the loaded gun he was pressing to his own lips. "To the new structure, Dario. May it bring us all exactly what we deserve." Dario slowly, deliberately picked up his own glass. He never broke eye contact with Lila, who stood frozen against the wall, her breath hitched in her throat. "Exactly what we deserve, Enzo," Dario murmured, the timbre of his voice dark, resonant, and laced with a terrifying finality. They drank. Lila clamped a hand over her mouth, retreating another step into the darkness. Enzo slammed his glass back onto the table, smacking his lips with a satisfied grin. "Now about the union bosses." He never finished the sentence. Enzo's eyes suddenly went wide, bulging against their sockets. The color drained from his face, replaced by an alarming, sickly pallor. He grabbed his own throat, a wet, choking gasp ripping from his lungs. "Boss?" Frankie stepped forward, his hand dropping toward the holster beneath his jacket. Enzo tried to stand, knocking his heavy oak chair backward onto the floor with a deafening crash. He convulsed, his hands clawing at his chest as the synthetic neurotoxin, designed to mimic a massive myocardial infarction, tore through his nervous system. Foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth. He collapsed onto the Persian rug, his body thrashing violently against the floorboards. Chaos erupted in the private dining room. Frankie drew his weapon, screaming for help. Patrons at other tables leapt to their feet, tables overturning, glass shattering. Through the absolute pandemonium, Matteo drew his custom 1911, leveling it directly at Frankie's chest. "Drop it!" Matteo roared over the din, "or I'll paint the walls with you!" Amid the screaming, the drawn guns, and the dying man convulsing on the floor, Dario Valenti did not flinch. He did not draw his weapon. He did not even stand up. He slowly set his half-empty glass down on the mahogany table. Then, with chilling calmness, he turned his head to look back into the shadows. Leela was backed against the wall, trembling violently, tears of sheer terror welling in her eyes. She had crossed the Rubicon. She had ended a Mafia capo's life to save a boss. There was no going back to her quiet, invisible existence. Dario's dark eyes burned into hers through the dim light of the dining room. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her with profound, absolute clarity. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I know what you did." The subterranean dining room of Il Crepuscolo descended into a frenzy of panicked survival. Screams echoed against the vaulted brick ceiling as high-powered lawyers, corrupt aldermen, and seasoned mobsters scrambled like rats fleeing a flooding ship. Waiters dropped trays of expensive china, the shattering ceramic masked by the chaotic symphony of shouting voices and overturning tables. Enzo Moretti lay motionless on the imported Persian rug, his sightless eyes staring up at the chandelier. The synthetic neurotoxin had worked with terrifying, brutal efficiency. To any paramedic or medical examiner, it would present exactly as a catastrophic, fatal myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack brought on by age, stress, and a diet rich in red meat and fine cigars. Frankie was on his knees beside his fallen boss, his hands trembling as he hovered over Enzo's chest, unsure whether to attempt CPR or draw his weapon again. Above him, Matteo stood like a monument carved from granite, his custom 1911 pistol still leveled in a deadly, unwavering line at Frankie's skull. "Call an ambulance," Dario Valenti commanded. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the pandemonium like a straight razor. He turned his dark, unreadable gaze to the remaining patrons who had frozen in the doorways. "Enzo has suffered a medical emergency. Give the man some dignity. Clear the room." Lila did not wait for a second invitation. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped, frantic bird. The silver serving tray slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the floorboards. But no one noticed. She was once again completely invisible. She backed away, slipping through the heavy velvet curtains that separated the VIP lounge from the chaotic kitchen. The kitchen staff was in an uproar, cooks shouting in rapid-fire Italian and Spanish, trying to peek through the porthole windows of the swinging doors. Lila bypassed them all. She untied her black apron with numb, shaking fingers, letting it fall to the grease-stained floor. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the employee locker room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I killed a man. I killed a Mafia capo." The thought looped in her brain, a terrifying mantra that threatened to pull her into a full-blown panic attack. She pushed through the heavy steel service exit, bursting out into the freezing, unforgiving air of the Chicago winter. The alleyway behind Il Crepuscolo was dark, smelling of stale garbage and freezing rain. Lila wrapped her coat tightly around her plush figure, pulling her scarf up to her nose, and began to run. She did not stop until she reached the blinding commercial glare of State Street. The holiday lights strung along the street lamps blurred into streaks of gold and white as she blinked back hot tears. The wind whipping off Lake Michigan was brutal, biting through her clothes, but she barely felt it. She just needed to disappear. She needed to pack a bag, empty her meager savings account, and catch the first bus out of Illinois. Back at Il Crepuscolo, the wail of approaching sirens bled through the heavy cellar doors. Dario stood calmly by the bar. He watched as the paramedics rushed in, completely ignoring the futile desperate chest compressions they applied to Enzo's lifeless body. His focus instead was entirely on the sweaty, pale bartender trembling behind the mahogany counter. Felix was frantically wiping down the brass speed rail, his eyes darting toward the back exit. He dropped a heavy bar towel, stooping down to pick it up, clearly calculating his chances of making a run for the alley. Before Felix could even straighten his spine, Matteo's massive hand clamped down on the back of the bartender's neck. The bodyguard dragged Felix over the counter, sending a display of expensive bitters crashing to the floor. Matteo pinned the terrified man against the mirrored wall, his forearm pressing ruthlessly against Felix's windpipe. "Where did you get the vial, Felix?" Dario asked, walking slowly toward the bar. He picked up the tainted glass Enzo had left behind, inspecting the remaining amber liquid against the dim light. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Valenti. I swear on my mother," Felix choked out, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple under Matteo's grip. "Your mother passed away some years ago," Dario replied smoothly, stepping directly into Felix's personal space. The air around the Mafia boss was practically vibrating with lethal intent. "And you owe a substantial debt to the Jimenez cartel for your cocaine habit. A debt that I imagine was recently forgiven in exchange for slipping a cardiotoxin into my Macallan." Felix's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. It wasn't just the cartel. They had an inside man. It was Frankie. Frankie paid me. He wanted Enzo out of the way, and he wanted to frame you so the commission would hand him the ports. I had no choice. Dario, please. Dario's expression remained entirely impassive. The twist was a calculated bet, a power grab by an ambitious underling. Frankie had played his own boss to steal the throne. "Matteo," Dario murmured quietly, turning his back on the weeping bartender. "Take Felix to the warehouse on the south side. Have a long conversation with him. Find out exactly who else Frankie has been talking to. Then ensure Felix never mixes another drink." "Yes, boss," Matteo grunted, hauling the sobbing man toward the private loading dock. Dario stepped out of the club, ignoring the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers blocking the street. His driver had already pulled the armored black Cadillac Escalade up to the curb, but Dario did not get in immediately. He looked down the street, his mind replaying the terrifyingly beautiful ballet of the quiet waitress who had saved his life. Society would call her clumsy, he thought, soft, invisible, and unremarkable. Yet in a room full of hardened killers, she was the only one who had possessed the situational awareness of a master tactician and the raw, unadulterated courage of a soldier. He pulled his phone from his tailored overcoat. "Find the waitress," he ordered his security team. "Lila Monroe. Track her. Do not let her out of your sight. Bring her to the St. Regis." Not far away, Lila was speedwalking down Rush Street, the towering, illuminated facade of the Drake Hotel casting long shadows across the icy pavement. She was freezing, her lungs burning with exertion. She checked over her shoulder again and again, convinced she saw men in tailored suits stepping out of every shadow. Suddenly, the squeal of heavy tires broke through the wind. A massive black Cadillac Escalade swerved aggressively, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic to block the crosswalk directly in front of her. Lila gasped, stumbling backward on the ice. The rear door of the SUV swung open with a heavy mechanical thud. Sitting in the plush leather interior, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard, was Dario Valenti. "Get in, Lila," his voice rumbled into the freezing street, a command wrapped in dark velvet. Lila shook her head wildly, her hands coming up defensively. "I didn't see anything. I swear to God, I don't know anything." "If you stay on this street, Frankie's men will find you by morning to tie up loose ends. The cartel will hunt you because you ruined their investment. You're a dead woman walking," Dario stated, his eyes locking onto hers with hypnotic intensity. He extended a large, impeccably manicured hand toward her. "Get in the car. I protect what belongs to me." Leela stared at his outstretched hand. She had spent her entire life hiding, shrinking herself down to survive in a world that despised her. Now, the most dangerous man in Chicago was offering her a lifeline. Trembling, she reached out, placing her cold, shaking fingers into his warm palm. He pulled her into the darkness of the Cadillac, and the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her fate. The penthouse suite of the St. Regis Chicago was a sprawling fortress of glass, gazam, steel, and imported Italian marble high above the glittering frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. Lila stood entirely still in the center of the massive living room, feeling like a muddy stray dog that had accidentally wandered into an art museum. Dario had stripped off his overcoat and suit jacket, leaving him in a crisp charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a faint lattice of old faded scars. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water at a wet bar and handed one to Lila. "Drink," he instructed gently, though the authority in his tone remained. "You are in shock." Lila took the glass, her hands shaking so violently that the ice clinked loudly against the crystal. She took a sip, the cold water grounding her slightly. "Are you going to kill me?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense strain. Dario paused. He looked at her, not with the predatory gaze of a mobster, but with genuine, profound curiosity. "Kill you, Lila? You saved my life tonight. Why would I execute my savior?" "Because I'm a liability," she blurted out, the brutal, honest truth of the underworld spilling from her lips. "I'm a witness. I know you know that Frankie poisoned the drink. I know Enzo was murdered. In your world, people like me don't get to live just because we did a good deed. We get buried in the foundations of new buildings." A slow, devastatingly handsome smirk played at the corner of Dario's mouth. "You are incredibly observant. You hide behind your apron and your silence, but you see everything, don't you?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space. Lila's breath hitched. She instinctively tried to step back, painfully aware of her size, her messy hair, and the cheap, unflattering fabric of her clothes in comparison to his terrifying elegance. But Dario reached out his hand, gently but firmly gripping her hip, stopping her retreat. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly soft, almost intimate. "You could have walked away. You could have let me drink the poison, and Enzo would have left a generous tip on my corpse. Why risk your life for a monster like me?" Leela looked up into his dark eyes, finding no judgment there, only a fierce, burning intelligence that saw right through her defenses. "Some time ago," she whispered, her cheeks flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. "In the coat room, a man named Sal cornered me. He put his hands on me. No one cared. They were all laughing. But you walked by. You told him to leave me alone. You looked at me like I was a human being." Dario stared at her, genuinely taken aback. He remembered the incident faintly, a minor correction of an associate lacking discipline. To him, it had been basic respect. To her, it had been a monumental act of mercy. "You risked a bullet to the head for a moment of basic decency," Dario murmured, his thumb lightly tracing the curve of her waist through her wool coat. He did not pull away from her softness. He anchored himself to it. "I pay my debts, Mr. Valenti," she said softly, lifting her chin with a sudden defiant pride. "Dario," he corrected, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "And you owe me nothing. In fact, the scales are heavily tipped in your favor," Felix confessed. He was bought by Frankie, who used cartel money. Soon the Valenti family will go to war to purge the traitors. It will be bloody, and Chicago will burn. Lila shuddered, the reality of the violence sinking in. What happens to me? You stay here, Dario commanded, his grip on her hip tightening possessively. You will be guarded by my best men. But when the dust settles, you are not going back to Il Crepuscolo. Lila felt a lump form in her throat. I need a job. I have rent. You misunderstand, Dario interrupted, taking a half step closer. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating. You have survived by being invisible, Lila, by letting the world overlook you. But I see you. I see a woman with a sharper mind than half my capos and more bravery than my entire security detail. He reached up, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. When this war is over, Dario vowed, his voice a low, rough whisper against her skin, you will not carry trays. You will sit at my table. You will be protected, respected, and feared. You saved the architect, Lila. Now I am going to build a fortress around you. Lila stared at the most feared man in Chicago, realizing with a terrifying thrill that her life as an invisible wallflower was dead and buried. In its place, something far more dangerous and incredibly alluring had just been born. She was no longer just the overlooked waitress. She was the queen the underworld never saw coming. If this pulse-pounding mafia romance left you breathless, the dangerous secrets of the underworld and Lila's journey from an invisible waitress to the formidable queen of the Chicago syndicate have only just begun. If you crave more thrilling stories filled with shocking twists, dangerous romance, and intense drama, show your support. Smash that like button, share this with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe while turning on the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter.